Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to dive into an interesting and fun topic that you probably don't think enough about, and that is the bugs and microorganisms and everything else that is living in our soil and how that works within our cropping and conservation programs. But before we dive into that here this afternoon, I have to stop and take a moment to thank our current sponsor of the Dairy Signal, which is Your Dairy Checkoff, DMI. So a huge thank you to them. And for those who probably are wondering, maybe a little bit more information about them, they are funded by America's Dairy Farm families. So many of those who are listening here today, and dairy importers. And the checkoff aims to grow sales and build trust in dairy. You can visit dairycheckoff.com to learn how they are making every drop count. So a huge thank you once again to DMI for their partnership and support of the Dairy Signal. But I also have to say, we love the Dairy Signal because it gets to bring you lots of different topics and lots of different areas of interest for those who are listening out there. And one of the ways that, as a listener, you can get involved in today's conversation is by asking questions. And depending on when you've joined us last, you might know that we've got a little bit of a facelift here on the Dairy Signal, and that makes it a little bit different from where you've previously asked questions. So if you're looking to ask your questions throughout today's episode, you can go to the bottom of your video screen and you're going to see three little dots. You're going to click those dots, and on there it says ask a question. From there, you do what it asks. You type in your question. It does ask for a name. Feel free to put anonymous. Feel free to put NA or anything else in between, or if you're comfortable, feel free to put your name as well. We don't judge either way. We just want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask your questions here for today's episode. But with all of that being said, we're going to get things right underway here. And joining us this afternoon, we have Dane Elmquist, who is a conservation cropping outreach specialist with UW-Madison Extension. So Dane, thank you so much for joining us here today. We're excited to have you. But for those who might not be familiar with you, would you mind giving them a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for the invite today, Amber. Happy to be here with you and your audience. So yeah, as Amber said, my name is Dane Elmquist. I'm a conservation cropping outreach specialist with UW-Madison Division of Extension. I'm in the Crops and Soils program based here in Madison, Wisconsin. My background is in entomology. So I'm a lover of insects and all things arthropods. And so that is one angle I think that I bring to my current position, which really focuses on learning and understanding how changing conservation cropping practices, the adoption of cover crops and no-till really affects these insect communities, because they're extremely important in driving a lot of the ecosystem services that I think farmers are interested in gaining from adopting these practices. So I've been with here at UW-Madison for about a year and a half, so still relatively fresh in my position, but I'm fortunate enough to have some things going and some irons in the fire, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with you all today. So thanks again for the invite, and happy to be here.
Well, Dane, I have to say, this is definitely one of those areas that I am no expert in. I am very much getting introduced to this topic with our listeners. So I'm excited to dive in and really learn more about what it means within, especially dairy farming and our forages and our soils and the insects and the world around us. So with all of that being said, I am going to let you take it away and get us started. And we'll ask questions intermittently. For those who might be listening, feel free to ask your questions. But without further ado, Dane, feel free to get us started.
All right, sounds great. Thanks. Yeah, as Amber said, I'm gonna start us off here with just a little bit of an informal presentation. When insects are involved, there's always a good opportunity to share some cool photos. But hopefully this is just kind of thought provoking, get some curiosities going, and then as Amber said, please feel free to ask questions, and I'll try to save a really good chunk of time for some Q&A at the end here. So with that, let's talk a little bit about cultivating beneficial insects using conservation cropping practices and integrated pest management. So being extension, I put my take-home messages here at the top. So we'll dive into those at first and move on. So first thing I hope you get out of this talk is that conservation cropping systems promote beneficial bugs, right? And today we're specifically going to focus on the soil arthropods, namely the predators and the decomposers. Second point, integrated pest management, also known as IPM, is really key to protecting these beneficial bugs or beneficial arthropods. And then, ultimately using IPM within conservation cropping systems is really going to make both practices more effective. All right, so this slide is really kind of the theme for today here. So, a growing number of dairy and grain farmers in Wisconsin and around the U.S. are adopting conservation cropping practices like no-till, cover crops, extending and diversifying crop rotations to build soil health, and with that, build soil life. Right, soil biology is one of those critical pillars of soil health. And when we think about soil biology, soil life, we're talking about microbes, earthworms, and also this really important group called the soil arthropods. So soil arthropods, they're things like insects and spiders, centipedes, millipedes, et cetera. They're a really abundant and diverse group of animals. And again, they're going to kind of be the focus of today's discussion. They're really important drivers of the ecosystem services that farmers really hope to utilize by switching over to some of these more conservation-based cropping practices. So after you build soil life, you must protect it. And that's really where using IPM, integrated pest management, working within that framework is a great way to do that. All right, so first let's meet some of the soil arthropods and talk a little bit about what they do. So I'm primarily going to focus today on two kind of ecological groups that we think of. First, the decomposers and also the predators. So decomposers, they're in the soil or on the soil surface, and they're shredding organic material. They're stimulating microbial activity through their feeding on microbes, through their feces in the soil. They're also really important in mineralizing plant nutrients, enhancing soil aggregation. They're burrowing in the soil and modifying the soil structure. And then when it comes to the predators, also known as natural enemies, these are the critical guys for controlling pest organisms. So just a little bit more on each of these groups here. So here's just an example of some of the larger groups of decomposers that we find in the soil. So mites, specifically mites in the group Orobatids, are really critical decomposers, along with their counterpart known as springtails, also called collembola, and things like millipedes. So again, these are the guys that are shredding organic material, and they're especially important in no-till and reduced-till systems because really they're the ones that are going to be processing that residue, that litter that's left on the soil, breaking it down, increasing that surface area for microbial colonization, which then allows more efficient mineralization of nutrients, returning that to the soil for our crops to use. Again, they also enhance soil aggregation and stimulate microbial activity. But the best way to get a handle on this is to watch this great video here. So this is basically decomposition of residue. We're seeing 15 weeks in 20 seconds. The picture on the left is decomposition in the absence of soil arthropods and soil fauna, decomposition on the right in the presence of soil arthropods and soil fauna. As you can see from this video here, if you're joining us online, that it's really, really enhances the decomposition rate of that litter on the soil surface. So really critical ecosystem service that they're providing in our reduced and no-till systems. So moving on to our other group here, predators. This is a big group that engages in what's called biological control. Lots of researchers, including us here at Wisconsin, are focused on ground beetles because they eat several of the early season crop pests, which we worry about in corn, soybean, and alfalfa production, like black cutworm, true armyworm, wireworms, and slugs, which we'll touch on later in the program today. That's great. There's also really important other predators in our systems like wolf spiders, as well as other species of mites that are not engaged in decomposition, but they're also in the soil eating small insects, eating eggs, and also preying upon nematodes as well. And biocontrol is not a trivial service. So there was a study out there that actually estimated that biocontrol in the USA is worth about $7 billion annually. So it's again, something that does make a difference, and it's worth thinking about how we can take advantage of these critters in our systems. I like to show this picture too here because this is a close-up shot of a ground beetle head, and you can see that mandible that I've pointed out there. That's you can really tell that's an animal that's out there hunting, capturing, and eating other animals. So kind of a cool pic there. Yeah, and on that note too, these predators have really fascinating hunting and feeding styles. This is just an example of that here. So this is a mite in a larger group of mites called the snout mites. Mites are arachnids, so they're able to produce silk. And this mite actually uses what's called a silk capture mechanism, which it actually will shoot the silk out of its snout. It kind of tethers the prey to its silk, and then it uses its raptorial mouth parts to finish the job. So really fascinating interactions occurring in the soil. And I'll just cap that off with one more video here of a ground beetle here predating or eating a corn earworm. So for those of you that might just be listening, this video shows a ground beetle attacking a corn earworm larvae on the soil surface. It catches it, breaks the integument, and now it's basically having a nice little lunch of corn earworm guts. So again, these are some fascinating interactions that are occurring in our soil systems. They're not always, visible to the naked eye necessarily, which is why I really like to show them in when we have opportunities like this, because again, these things are occurring out in our fields. It's just that we might not always see them. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why no-till and cover crops allows for this, right? Allows for these beneficial insects. So no-till is the real base of all of this and makes conservation, biological control possible. The no-till, reduces disturbance, increases habitat complexity, and really provides a really good habitat for these beneficial organisms to exist and to do their jobs. And cover crops really enhance things further. They take it to the next level. They allow for even increased habitat complexity. Provisioning of alternative resources is a big one. Those decomposers that are present in our fields, they act as an alternative prey source for some of those predators who need something else in times when maybe prey like corn earworm are not necessarily present in the field. So having this cover cropped and no-till allows for some of those alternative prey resources to be available for predators, and that actually keeps them based in the field there, so that when they are needed for when a corn earworm comes along, they're ready. They're already in our field. And then again, cover crops, as many of you are familiar with, they just stretch that habitat. Not having that fallow period in between cash crops allows for more habitat earlier and later in the season. Again, so that these natural enemies primarily are present in our fields when they are needed, which oftentimes is early in the season when many of our seedlings, corn, soybean seedlings, could be at risk from certain insect pests. So that's kind of the, little bit of a dive into the mechanisms behind how this stuff actually works. And there's some really good evidence out there from numerous studies here showing that growers can take advantage of these, winter cover crops to conserve predatory arthropods prior to cash crop establishment. This is just an example here from a corn and soybean system, really showing again the power of cover crops on predation and biological control. So here on the horizontal axis, we're just looking at the predator abundance. So this is the number of ground beetles that this group found in the field, and that vertical axis just showing predation. And you see a really strong relationship between predator abundance and predation in these cover cropped fields. Here we're looking at two different scenarios. One is corn into cereal rye, and one is corn into a hairy vetch triticale mix. And it's kind of hard to tell from this figure, but there are more predators actually in the mixed hairy vetch triticale cover crop. Again, this kind of harkens back to that previous slide that has to do with more complex, more diverse habitat, different plant residue architectures, less amount of soil exposed, really boosting those beneficial populations. And it's not just about soil predators. So this is a little bit of work that we did last year in Wisconsin. We were monitoring true armyworm as part of the DATCAPS monitoring network, just to see if there was any impact on moth numbers in fields where corn was planted after a cereal rye cover crop or into a field with no previous cover crop. So we monitor moths using these like green bucket traps. Some of you have maybe seen these outside of fields. It's got a pheromone lure to catch the moths. And so we go through these and we, count up the number of moths. But in this case, we actually kept all the trap bycatch, which is just like all the other insects that we catch in the traps besides the target insect, which is the true armyworm. And we identified and quantified natural enemies that we found in the bycatch because we were like, hey, they're here. Why not? Let's just take a look. see what we can see. We collected 280 natural enemies from 22 different arthropod groups last year, and we saw some pretty stark differences. So these graphs here that I'm showing show natural enemy abundance on the top, so just how many individuals, and their diversity, so how many there were from different groups, and how even they are within that sample. We just saw a lot more natural enemy predators, a lot higher diversity in cover cropped fields that had that rye cover crop. Most of the natural enemies were kind of these in ants, bees, and wasps, followed by beetles. Green lacewings, which are in the insect family Chrysopidae, they're really well-known biological control agents, and it was really cool to see because they were like consistently present in the bycatch, in our traps, outside of all of the cover crop fields every week. So it's not just the soil; it also impacts what we have flying around in our fields as well. All right, so we've established that conservation cropping practices are practices used to build soil health are also building this arthropod life. But let's talk a little bit about protecting it, right, using integrated pest management. So goal of IPM really is to use a combination of biological, chemical, and cultural control tactics to control any pests that might show up in your field. The idea was first introduced by entomologists in California back in 1959, so it's like been around for a while. It's not a novel concept or anything, but it was introduced to really do a couple of things. First, IPM really introduced this idea of really ensuring profitability when we are using pesticides to ensure an economic return. So I think sometimes IPM gets a bad rap in terms of like saying it's not about using any insecticides. If you look at this figure here on the slide, insecticides is actually one of the pillars of IPM. It's just using them in a judicious manner. So if we want to use an insecticide, we like to take into account like the amount of insects, the amount of damage occurring in the field, compare that to the cost of an insecticide and to the value of the crop, and that will help ensure profitability. So that's kind of one unique angle that IPM brought into the scene. The other thing I want to mention here is that using IPM to protect natural enemies and allow them to do the work that the insecticide would do was kind of the other really big point that was brought forward by this concept. So by using IPM, not spraying insecticides, say, on a calendar basis or using them prophylactically or preventatively, we can have more natural enemies in the fields, and then they become allies in pest control and really do some of the work for us. And so to implement IPM, it really relies on avoiding preventative insecticides, thinking about using insecticides in a judicious manner when they're needed and when we know that they'll be profitable. Part of that is really involves scouting to know what's in your fields. So scouting is a really critical point to get across when you're thinking about using IPM, because then you're out there scouting, you're able to compare pest populations to economic thresholds. And then control populations once they exceed the economic threshold, because at that point, it's going to pay off. So unfortunately, over the last several years, field crops have largely, moved away from this IPM mindset and use more of a preventative strategy. And this leads to some unintended consequences, which I think a lot of us that are really focused on, soil health systems, we are aware of and trying to move away from. So this includes things like resistance development. We want to keep these insecticides, these useful tools in the tool chest. We want them to work when we need them to work. And preventative and kind of prophylactic use can work against us for that goal. There's also environmental concerns. Water pollution is just one example, kind of off target. I was just reading a thing the other day, about there's one or more pesticides that are found in about 43% of I think it's like 800,000-ish private wells in Wisconsin. So again, these off target effects are things that we could start to maybe move away from within an integrated pest management framework. And also some of the ecological functions that we want to maximize, like in our conservation cropping systems, can be slowed, like decomposition. Can also decrease the good insects and make pest problems worse. After spraying, pests often come back faster because they can reproduce quickly. They move in from nearby fields. They sometimes survive the prey better than their natural enemies. Predators, natural enemies, on the other hand, they reproduce slower. They're often more sensitive to the insecticides, and they may actually starve if pest numbers are too low right after the treatment. It's sort of like hitting the reset button in a race, and the pests are on motorbikes and the predators are on foot. So the pests often get back to the finish line first. And I'm just going to share a couple examples of the last 2 points with some case studies here to sort of drive this home a little bit. Um, so let's think again about protecting soil life. One question we can ask is if insecticides are limiting decomposition. So here's a little case study from a study out of Pennsylvania that asked this question. They used something called litter bags, which is basically where you put a known amount of litter residue out in a bag in the field, and you basically go out and you collect those bags at certain time points, and you weigh those bags to determine how much litter mass was lost over a certain amount of time. So this group did that for 3 years. In different plots that were either untreated, had no insecticide, had a broadcast pyrethroid insecticide, or were in a plot where the crop was treated with a neonicotinoid insecticidal seed treatment. So here we're looking at one of the figures from that paper that shows three different lines. So the blue line here is where no insecticide was used, so decomposition happening at a normal speed. The other two lines are where our insecticides were used. And what we see here is that there were 10% slower decomposition rates when insecticides was used. So basically, these insecticides were delaying decomposition. And they were delaying decomposition because they were actually decreasing the number of some of those really important decomposers that we just touched on earlier in the system. So they noticed that there were significantly fewer springtails and significantly fewer millipedes, which again are really important at breaking down that litter residue on the surface, allowing microbes to do a better job of cycling nutrients. So it's not that crazy of a suggestion that fewer decomposers means slower decomposition, but it's especially important to think about if you're in a no-till or reduced-till system, because you need these guys to be breaking down residue timely and cycling nutrients as well. All right, so here's another case study here, just driving these points home. This is again from Pennsylvania, coming out of their Diversified Dairy Cropping Systems project. So here they're comparing two different rotations. There's a more conventional corn soy rotation and a more diverse rotation that includes things like cover crops, a small grain, multiple years of alfalfa, in addition to corn. So the conventional rotation used what we sort of think of as business as usual pest management practices. They use Bt corn hybrids, seed treatments, broadcast pyrethroid insecticides on more of a calendar basis. They weren't really using the scouting approach. So this is what we kind of can think of as a low diversity preventative pest management approach. The other rotation had took an IPM approach to their pest management. So they did not use Bt, they did not use seed treatments. They scouted and used insecticides when needed. So two very different ends of the spectrum there. This is more of a high diversity integrated pest management system. So we'll take a quick look at just one kind of summary graph from their study. Basically what they found was that no-till and diversity, that extended crop rotation that's really common with dairies and cover crops, really helped build those predator populations. So here what we're looking at are on the vertical axis are just the number of, in this case, they were looking at slug predators because they're having really bad slug problems in these systems. Slug predators on the vertical axis, and then just our two different cropping systems. Again, the high diversity IPM system with the white dots, if you're joining us on video, and the low diversity cropping system with the black dots. And basically what we see here is that no-till and diversity built these predator populations over time. If you see year one, I'll bring up my pointer here, just use the mouse here. Year one and year two, we really didn't see any divergence between the two different systems. It really took about 3 years to start to be for those predator populations to build up in the high diversity system and to start to really see differences between the low diversity system. So it doesn't happen overnight, which I think is an important point to get across here as well. What they did find, though, was that increased predators, maybe unsurprisingly, helped suppress slug populations. So more predators meant less plants damaged by slugs, and both of these systems produced competitive yield. In this case, the high diversity system outperformed the low diversity system, really kind of suggesting that the high intensity kind of preventative insect management was not necessary for competitive yield in this systems experiment, at least. And you can tell I'm a nerd because this is one of my favorite studies because it really shows IPM in action. So during the third year of this study, they had a severe true armyworm outbreak in the high diversity system. So what did they do? They went out, They scouted, they determined that the insects passed the economic threshold levels. They sprayed with a selective insecticide that was a little nicer, specific to Lepidoptera, to caterpillars, and a little nicer to, say, the ground beetles. But that's exactly how IPM should work, right? So instead of spraying every year across the 6 years of this experiment, like they did in the low diversity treatment, this only required one spray out of 6 years. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of start to wrap things up and share a little bit about some work that we're doing here in Wisconsin. And let's stick on the subject of slugs, because they're a great case study into why coupling IPM with conservation cropping systems is a good idea. So slugs had a big year in 2024 as pests in Wisconsin field crops. I'm sure there's some members of the audience that probably dealt with this. I know I was certainly getting quite a few calls here last year, and they were especially problems in no-till and cover crop systems. They're really kind of a side effect of no-till. Why? Well, they thrive in habitats that are moist, protected, undisturbed, have a moderated temperature, and lots of residue. So that sounds like a no-till cropping system, right? They're really the scourge of many growers that have been using no-till and cover crops for a long time, especially out in areas that are maybe a little farther along than we are here in Wisconsin in their conservation cropping journey, like the Mid-Atlantic. An estimate from the University of Delaware, I think, put it that it was about 20% of no-till acreage in Mid-Atlantic states loses yields from slugs each year. So they can be a big problem. They're less of a historical problem in Wisconsin, but they could be an issue as no-till becomes more common and we see Wisconsin's environment change with warmer winters and wetter springs. If you think back to 2024, that was a relatively mild winter. The spring of 24 was quite wet. So that was like perfect conditions for slug populations in our state. And with projected environmental change in Wisconsin, that type of weather pattern might not be, also unusual. That might be more of the norm in the future. So another challenge to slug control is that they're mollusks, right? They're not insects. So they're actually not affected by insecticides. And studies have actually shown that the use of insecticides, specifically some of the neonic seed treatments, can actually make slug problems worse via their impact on natural enemies. There are some options for chemical control. So we call those molluscicides because they target mollusks. Metaldehyde baits are a common one, but they're expensive and their efficacy can be hit or miss. And in Wisconsin, they actually, unfortunately, cannot be used on soybeans, which is where slug outbreaks can be a major economic concern, more so than corn in most years. So for slug control, promoting natural enemies are predators, those ground beetles in the fields, and leveraging their biological control potential by coupling conservation cropping systems with IPM is really one of the best ways to think about managing and mitigating slug damage. So and I just share a picture of one. This is a tiger beetle, a type of ground beetle that we have here in Wisconsin. This is just a picture from a field about 30 minutes away from Madison, where they were running around when I was working out there. They're, again, a type of ground beetle. They're really known for their impressive speed. They're showy colors. This one's a nice iridescent green, rather large. Here's your fun insect fact of the day. These guys actually can run so fast that they blind themselves. Their eyes cannot capture enough light to form images of the prey that they're after, and so they kind of like stop intermittently while running to wait for their vision to catch up. So they're excellent hunters and great slug predators out there. But yeah, slug pressure is just one of those unpredictable challenges in the push to improve soil health with practices like no-till and cover crops. And one challenge is that my program and others, Dr. Emily Bick here in the Digital Entomology Lab at UW-Madison, have started to focus on recently. So we're just kind of entering this world, and I'm happy to share a little bit about what we're doing with you guys today. So again, the relationship between cover crops and pests and beneficial natural enemies is pretty complex, not yet fully understood, because it really depends on a lot of different management factors, including type of cover crop, environmental conditions, and then when the cover crop is terminated. So to better understand all of these different interactions, University of Wisconsin Madison Extension teamed up with Dane Demo Farms, which is a network of demonstration farms in Dane County, here in South Central Wisconsin. And we started a trial at 3 farms in Dane County. Basically, with our goal was to examine how different cover crop termination timings affect slug pressure and their natural enemies, mainly again looking at those ground beetles. So this study in particular compares early cover crop termination, which is like as soon as the farmer can get out in the field in the spring, they're going to terminate that cover crop. I should mention we're working with rye cover crop in all of these studies. Our other termination timing is, kind of the standard 2 weeks prior to planting, which is what you hear a lot as recommended out there. And termination at planting. So really pushing it, letting it grow a lot, letting that biomass really accumulate, and then basically, planting green. And of course, we have a no cover crop control as well. And I should mention that these are all done in no-till systems. So they already have that kind of basic no-till under their belt. And now they're moving on towards cover crops and trying to dial in that termination strategy. So we tracked slug pressure and natural enemies throughout the early growing season this year. Kind of with the thought that modifying when these cover crops are terminated could help farmers encourage some of these beneficial insects while keeping the pest numbers in check. And again, since these slugs are, a growing challenge in these soil health focused systems, and are notoriously hard to manage, learning how to use natural enemies to help control them could be a valuable tool. So as I mentioned, we just started this. This is our first year. We're actually just starting to go through the data too, as of like 2 weeks ago. And so I have some really preliminary results to share with you guys just from a single farm here in Dane County. Because we're still in the process of counting and identifying like lots and lots of beetles. Speaking of those beetles, just wanted to share a little bit about like what they look like, what these communities are that we're finding out in our agricultural fields here. So a lot of different species out there. These are all ground beetles in the family Carabidae. A lot of different species, a lot of diversity. They all kind of look the same size in these pictures, but it really ranges a lot. That beetle in the top left is like less than 1/10 of an inch big, compared to some that are over an inch big, like that large green tiger beetle. So just some of the cool diversity that's out there in the fields. Again, these are our allies in pest control, these ground beetles. And compared to 2024, 2025 has been a pretty low pressure slug year, likely because we had a pretty cold winter with minimal snow cover when temps were really low, which is great slug killing weather. But again, we still were able to run our trials here, collect a lot of ground beetles, and I'll share just a little bit of preliminary results of what we found so far. We will be repeating this for a few more years too. Okay, so let's take a look at slug pressure first. So right now, that picture that you're seeing is a shingle trap. That's what we actually use to monitor slugs. So you can't really tell on there, but there's 4 slugs on there. And then we're looking here on our vertical axis on this graph is the number of slugs per 3 shingles, and then our different cover crop treatments on the horizontal axis. What we saw was, slugs were lowest when there was no cover crop. Maybe that's somewhat intuitive based on some of the things that we've just talked about, and slug numbers were relatively the same when there was a cover crop. Maybe a little higher at the 2 weeks before planting termination, but no real differences. So if there was a cover crop, we found slugs basically. Now let's take a little bit look at slug feeding damage. So we went out in the field and we would actually score plants for feeding damage during the early growth stages. In this case, we were looking at corn using a numbered system based on defoliation, where like 0 is no damage and 4 is like the seedling is totally gone. Here you can see some pictures of like what injury rating 1 and injury rating 3 would look like, just so you can kind of see what we were seeing in the field there. And when we take a look at our results, we're looking at the slug feeding damage severity on the vertical axis, and again, horizontal axis, just our different cover crop treatments. Again, when there was no cover crop, we didn't find a lot of slugs, and coincidentally, there's minimal slug feeding. Makes sense. Gets a little bit more interesting when we take a look at our cover crops, though. So in the early spring termination and the 2 weeks before planting termination, slug damage severity was greater compared to the termination at planting treatment. We actually saw a 50% decrease in feeding damage severity. So that was interesting because we were still finding slugs in that treatment. We just weren't seeing the damage. Well, I think we get a clue as to why when we look at our ground beetle data. So here you can see, again, looking at the figure here, number of ground beetles on the vertical axis, cover crop treatments horizontal. we captured way more beetles in our termination at planting treatment than we did compared to the other termination treatments. So again, we saw about the same number of slugs between all the cover crop termination treatments, but roughly a 50% decrease in damage severity in the termination at planting treatment, which could be due to more beetles, actively hunting and killing the slugs when termination is delayed until planting. These are pretty encouraging results. I was happy to see this just from like looking at one farm after 1 year. We'll see if this pattern holds as we continue analyzing our data, again, repeating the experiments again next year. So again, very preliminary, but kind of exciting. And this is, this is the direction that we would hope things would be headed in when we're thinking about natural enemies and how we can manage them. So by tracking, both slug pests and their natural enemies, these ground beetles across these different termination timing, we're really hoping that some of this can shed light on how farmers can really fine tune the cover crop management to both balance like your soil health objectives with pest control, and understanding these relatively complex dynamics, I think is a really key step to making cover crops and the promotion of natural enemies and biological control really a more reliable and sustainable tool here in Wisconsin. So that's it for me. Just wrapping up here with take-home messages again. No-till with cover crops promotes beneficial arthropods. Specifically, we're talking about those predators like our ground beetles and decomposers, which are involved in breaking down that residue and recycling those nutrients to the soil. Integrated pest management, IPM, is really key to protecting those beneficial arthropods, thinking about our cover crop management strategies, thinking about a judicious use of pesticides. And then again, just coupling them together, using IPM within the conservation cropping systems, whether that's reducing insecticides or modifying your cover crop termination to boost those natural enemies, really makes these conservation cropping systems more effective for pest control. So with that, thank you. I hope there's some questions out there. Happy to chat a little bit here with you, Amber, as well. I am interested in hearing from folks in the audience. If you do want to get in touch, just chat about this stuff some more. If you have questions or feedback or want to work together on things, I've got my contact information here. Is my email and my cell phone. I'm more than happy to chat with folks. So feel free to reach out. Hopefully this has been inspired some questions and curiosities in the audience. So thank you again for your time.
Well, Dane, we definitely have questions that have come through, so we'll get to those in a second. I do have to say, as listening through, and I've, heard and many of people talk about IPM before, but not necessarily in the way that we really kind of dove into it here this afternoon. And I have to say, I appreciate that it's been around for a long time. It's something that's been utilized, but, I think about the dairy farmer mentality and that a lot of the times we are trying to prevent things from happening. We're trying to prevent lameness. We're trying to prevent mastitis. We really are a preventative group, and how that might transition into how we have been thinking about our pest management and insecticides on our fields. So it's interesting to hear a different way and a different approach that might just have some great benefits that we've got to work through and think about what might be different on our farm if this is the route we're looking to take. But let's start with some of the questions. I want to make sure we get to those. So the first question that we have that came in reads, is there ways to help grow decomposers and predators without being in a full no-till system?
Yeah, that is a great question. So yes, I would say yes that there is. I would say focusing on reducing tillage as much as possible would be a great step. If you're not committed to going full no-till, there are other options. Strip till, vertical till, things like that are just a little bit lighter on the soil, that minimizes disturbance maybe than that, more so than a really a full till operation. Those are going to be really beneficial for, again, boosting those communities. You can also always grow cover crops, right? Even if you're still in a tillage system, and that will help. You will get that extended habitat in between the cash crops, so you're not having that fallow period, which again is really useful for some of these natural enemies. But I would encourage also thinking about your non-crop habitat as a place to potentially encourage the promotion of these beneficial arthropods. So maybe leave that hedgerow. Maybe don't mow as much. There are these little tiny, or grass waterways is another great option for using some of that non-crop habitat. Excuse me. Thinking about that in a little bit of a different way is it would be good options for promoting some of these natural enemies and decomposers. But yeah. Usually we think about the reduction in tillage as being pretty important. So if you can back that off, as much as you're comfortable, that's going to go a long way for in the field.
Okay, I think that's a great way to be thinking about it, that if you can do no-till, great, but there's other options if that's not the option that you are able to take or looking to take at this time. So there's ways to promote and benefit. It might just not be the same, but there's still ways to do something a little bit different. Next question
Exactly.
here. Perfect. Yeah, next question here reads, um, is it ever too little, too late in using insecticides when using IPM? I worry we won't realize until we're too late.
Is it ever too little, too late? I don't know if I am understanding the question. Maybe it could be rephrased. Yeah, I don't know if I'm understanding too little, too late. Maybe you could try to rephrase that for me.
I'm going to do my interpretation of it then.
Yeah, great.
Unless somebody else, unless they want to re-type it in or re-enter a question, feel free to do so. I'm taking it as either like the number of insects that it gets too much, it overpowers, it starts to do more damage than they're realizing, or I'm wondering if it has to do something with the next question here, which is like economic threshold and not being able to work on that front. But take that as you will.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I guess maybe yeah, going off of that interpretation, too little, too late. So yeah, I think an important point to think about too when you're thinking about the judicious use of insecticides is really is managing for the pests that you have, right? That you have. That's where scouting comes in. Again, that's where the economic thresholds come in. And so if there are pests that you are having issues with that are consistent, you know, usually above the economic threshold, that is the time to rely on our chemical control tactics, right? If your number one pest is slugs, then now it's time to if we're managing for the pest that we have and that's a slug, well, that's when we start to maybe rethink a little bit more about our chemical control tactics. But yeah, certainly there is a place for using insecticides within an IPM framework, especially if you know that you have these pests that are threatening your yield. They've surpassed economic thresholds, then yeah, that's really using all of the thinking through this framework in the correct way to go ahead and pull the trigger at that point. And I apologize if I'm not answering the original question. Please do email me if you want to follow up on that. But yeah, I guess it's my best shot there.
Fair enough. That's all we can ask for. Next question reads, how is economic threshold determined?
Yeah, that is a great question. So it is basically looking for many pests. Researchers have worked out what the lowest population density is that will cause economic damage to the crop, and this is what we call the economic injury level. So this is done a lot. A lot of it is done in research settings, in the field. Some of it's done in the laboratory as well. But basically, again, it's working out what the lowest pest density is that's going to cause economic damage. That's the economic injury level. The economic threshold then is set below that economic injury level. And that is the point at which we want to take action so that pest threshold never reaches the economic injury level where it's going to cause economic damage to the crop. And these economic thresholds are things like the density of a pest, or it can be plant injury, like percent defoliation. So here in Wisconsin, we have an excellent resource. A3646 is the shorthand for it, but it's managing pests in Wisconsin field crops. So all about managing pathogens, weeds, and insects in Wisconsin field crops. And they have, for most of the pests in there, they have really well-defined economic thresholds. So you can, go to that resource, look things up. Oftentimes it's going to change in some cases on the stage of the plant, or the stage of the insect. And so there's some nuances here and there with determining when the economic threshold is. But yeah, more or less, it's really about never letting that pest population reach that density that's going to cause economic damage to the crop. And it's all done through very, very painstaking research in the field often.
Okay. I think that's helpful in understanding how that's determined, and maybe a little more comforting for some folks who are trying to think about, okay, well, what is that population density? You're not having to figure it out on your own if there are areas that can help when determining that. Next question here reads, does utilizing dairy manure help increase or promote diversity in these systems, or does it not add any impact?
Yeah, that's a super question. So the manure question is one I've thought a little bit about since coming to Wisconsin here. Um, it is there's some good studies out there that have shown manure is positive for promoting some of these beneficial arthropods, namely the decomposers. Because right, if you think about it, you're adding a lot more organic matter into that system, oftentimes with increased moisture too, and that is a good thing for these guys. So yes, manure in those cases is beneficial. I will say when it comes to thinking about our slug issues, there's been some work out there that's shown like, well, that might actually be that's not helping. Just to for the same reasons, right? You're putting in organic matter into the system. There's more moisture. Those are things that slugs like. So it's kind of like that a fine balance, right? That we're trying to think about here. So it's a great question, and there's I think still a lot of work to be done in that space. So it's sort of a trade-off, If you've got severe slug issues in certain fields, then those might be ones to think twice about applying manure to. But if things are kind of business as usual, then manure application is going to be beneficial on the grand side of things for these beneficial arthropods, namely the decomposers and the natural enemies too, to a lesser extent. It's a good question.
So it really depends on what you're looking for, it sounds like. If you're and what your current system is already having and potentially having not of problems. So,
Yeah. Yeah, the
okay.
dairy systems, like in some sense, I think they have a little bit of an advantage over like the straight grain farms when it comes to really building these crop rotations to support beneficial insects. More built-in forage diversity within like the alfalfa, rye, triticale, multi-year crops that disturb the soil less often, more continuous cover and habitat for some of these soil-dwelling predators. And then the seasonal forage harvests that don't necessarily involve like full tillage or synthetic inputs. So yeah, compared to your straight grain farmer colleagues, there's some more opportunities I think in dairy systems for promoting these beneficial arthropods.
Okay. And then one of our next questions here reads, how do you know if you have an adequate abundance of predators and decomposers in your soil after doing no-till practices? So, wonderfully vague question that you can go 100 different ways, and I mean that with the most love because that is loaded.
Yeah, no, it is a great question, and I don't think that we as researchers and extension really have a great answer to it. Like there's no outside of doing some like really intensive sampling and things like that. I would say you know being out there in your field, being out there and scouting and just doing some kind of simple observations. One thing that a farmer recently shared with me. Was that he's been no-till for about 40 years. Cover crops, not as long, but still a pretty long time. And he always remarks, and his colleagues also remark to him about how fast his residue disappears. By the time it's harvest, that residue that was there in the spring is gone on his field. So, that to me would suggest that you've got a pretty active decomposer community. Those millipedes, those springtails, they're out there, they're breaking down that residue and cycling it back into the soil. So, just observations like that, taking into account like, all right, well, it's springtime here. I'm planting. I've got, this much residue on my field here. You take a mental snapshot. And then when it comes back to harvesting that field, take a look at what that residue is like. That can really clue you into to how well your system might be functioning in terms of promoting some of these decomposers. The predator question is a little tougher. A lot of these guys are active at night too. So like those ground beetles, they all hunt at night, so we don't really see them when we're out during the day. Again, that's one that takes probably just a little bit of observation. If you're comfortable enough and you feel okay with where things are at on your farm, maybe leaving a field, not plant a field without treated seed. Skip the calendar spray just in one field. Don't do the whole farm. Start small and just compare to what you see in that field that you skip those interventions on versus the field that you kind of went around business as usual. And just take note, observe, am I seeing pest problems? Do I see a lot of slug damage? Are the slugs still there, but my yield has not changed? Those are things that can kind of clue you in to sort of where those communities are at. But yeah, that is a great question. I think a lot of it is just kind of observation and really knowing your land, which is something that all farmers are really great at. So yeah, something I would, encourage you all to be doing, especially if you're starting to think along these lines a little bit more on your own operations.
I have to say, I think that's the one thing that not one, there's many things I love about dairy farmers, but one of the areas that I absolutely love is we're always thinking about the land, the soil, the animals. There's so much that's part of this system. And while we can't do it all perfectly all the time, I think that's where the beauty of there's always areas to learn and grow and adapt and try. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. Try something. I mean, it might not work out perfectly. It might not be the results you wanted, but it also gives you a starting place, an idea of where you're at. And I think that also has a lot of beauty in it as well. So, last question though for you here this afternoon, Dane, and that is from today's discussion, what are one or two things you really want producers to be thinking about or actively doing after today?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, I guess in terms of thinking about, think about your soil arthropods, right? It's a really rich community that you've got out in your field, and they're doing a lot of really good things for the land. And oftentimes, the goals of adopting these soil health practices, they're often realized through these beneficial arthropod communities. They're really the ones that are moving the needle on a lot of these ecosystem services. And in terms of actual management practices, I would definitely consider your insecticide use. Really be judicious about when you're using insecticides. It can be comfortable to be in an insurance-based mindset, but the more we learn about these things, we could be shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit. So really, kind of thinking about the judicious use of pesticides, using only when we know that we need them, and managing for the pests that we have, not necessarily the pests that we think we might have. And then things like fine tuning little pieces of the puzzle, like we talked about with cover crop termination. Having a cover crop is a great start, but like Amber just pointed out, with curiosity amongst this group and wanting to experiment and try things, go out there, mess around with termination timing. There's a lot of other benefits that you gain just outside of the pest control from delaying termination timing, right? That have to do with soil health, erosion control, potentially weed control as well. So yeah, adopting some of these conservation practices is great, but there's also room to kind of fine tune again for your goals and objectives. And hopefully one of those now is promoting beneficial natural enemies.
Well, Dane, I have to say thank you so much for your time here today, especially as we really haven't dove into this area previously on the Dairy Signal. So it's a fun opportunity to not only learn something new, but also about potentially be thinking about what's going on our dairy farms and how we can potentially think about integrating some of these practices into what we do every day and every year. So thank you so much for your time here this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Amber, for the invite, and thanks everyone for your attention today.
I also have to say thank you once again to DMI, your dairy checkoff, for being the sponsor currently of the Dairy Signal. We really appreciate their support of being able to provide education like this to you wherever you are at. Hopefully, you learned something here this afternoon and are always on the path to continued learning. And if you are and you're wondering what's going on in the world of professional dairy producers, we've got a lot of really great programs coming up. We've got our tech tours next week. We start those already, which is crazy to think. Following that, we have our Ace on the Farm Twilight meetings. And we also currently have ongoing our sustainability initiative, Your Farm, Your Footprint, and so much more that is happening. So make sure to head over to our website at pdpw.org to learn more. But for now, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you here on Thursday. Bye now.